is Fatima Hussein. She is the AP reporter on the Treasury Department. Before that, she was at Bloomberg Law, Indy Star, Cincy Inquirer, and so she's got a lot of experience both in terms of covering Treasury issues as well as covering legal issues, and she is going to talk to us today about sanctions. So if this is something that you all of a sudden find yourself covering, she will have the answers for you. So thank you.
Thank you. Hi everybody. I'm Fatima, sitting down in front of you. Okay. Yes, so I started with the AP January 10th, and it has been a little more than 2 months, and I've been pulled in as the main reporter covering sanctions for the White House team. And that was a daunting task because I never covered sanctions before. I had never covered the White House. I covered administrative law and occupational safety law during the pandemic, which is kind of important, but never anything having to do with this. So I'm going to go through sort of what I did and what I thought would be the best way to cover sanctions on the fly with a totally new beat, and doing that in a way that my editors have appreciated. They say I'm doing a good job, so I'll believe them. I could always be better. Okay, so the big thing first, Congressional Research Service. I hope you guys go to this, or you all go to this all the time for everything. So what we're going to do, once this pulls up, we're going to click on the Congressional Research Service page. I really hope everybody has already gone to this already and uses it for literally everything. For cryptocurrency, I had no idea what cryptocurrency was. You can look that up on the CRS. And so the first thing I did when I was told I have to look up or have to write about sanctions was I looked up Russia sanctions in the Congressional Research Service, and it pulled up a document that, okay, there we go. This is the whole presentation. Sorry, I didn't have something fancy. This is just on the fly. I'm covering sanctions right now. So I click on this, and we can look up Russia sanctions. I wanted to make it as easy as humanly possible. And then it pulls up, before this, it was January that I started, and there was a January document, and it kind of goes through everything that in the history of sanctions in Russia, it kind of explains, like, for dummies and for smart people, how, like, what is the history of sanctions? Like, what is America's strategy when it comes to Russia? And that, to me, was really important because, sorry, I have a watery eye. It's just gonna happen. So it shows you everything there is to know in terms of strategy. And that's really, really, really helpful because you can read other reporters' work, and every reporter is smarter than another reporter in something else. But when it comes to understanding what the country and what it's, at least at the time of the writing of the document, what their thinking is, it's really incredibly helpful. So highly suggest it. And actually there was a couple of documents that came out recently that go into sanctions now. So there's no one better and there's no place better to just at least get that rudimentary understanding from the CRS for everything. And I hope that I'm saying I'm covering sanctions, but this is also just covering any new topic if you're just thrown into a fire to cover it. So you'll go through the document. You'll see certain words that you didn't understand before. You'll understand that the Treasury Department, they are the ones that, or that's the agency that administers and imposes sanctions. You'll find out that it's the Office of Foreign Assets Control that does the main sanctions administration. And then you'll find out the specially designated nationals list is where you'll find the individuals who are put on the sanctions list. So you get all this information. Like me, I was sort of like, whoa, okay, this is a lot of stuff. So I Googled a lot of things. Like I Googled all the meanings of things. Google is your best friend. And go through the OFAC sanctions list search. I'm trying not to make this boring for you. I just want to give you as much information as you could possibly consume, and then you can kind of click on things later. But if you click on the sanctions list search, what's important is to remember that when sanctions are administered, it goes through an executive order. And if you know what executive order the sanction is administered and imposed through, then you can go through the OFAC sanctions list search. And let's say, okay, so we're going to look up Ukraine, the EO on Ukraine. That was sort of, and we don't have to do this because it'll pull up a lot of entries, but you can, for instance, let's go to, where is it? How do you spell Ukraine? Just kidding. Here, so, this is a Mac. Okay, let's see, can I do that, and that, and that, and that? So this is the main executive order on Ukraine, and then it'll pull up a bunch of names. Maybe you have a certain person in mind, like Putin's press secretary or something of that nature. I don't know the name of Putin's press secretary off the top of my head, but you could go through this and find that individual. Gazprom, that major company that sells oil on behalf of Russia, you can see that listed pretty a lot. There are a lot of entries about it. So as you can see, this is where you'd find the sanctions list. This is a very helpful list, and I don't think a lot of people go to this list. Yeah, go ahead.
When you click on each name, does that lead you to specifically, like, is that list, is there any other information you can get from that list?
You could, like, there's not a lot of information. It just kind of tells you where it's based, but it can at least tell you if an individual is or is not on the list. Also important to note, it's like, I think it's in the fine print somewhere here, just because someone's on the sanctions search list doesn't necessarily mean the sanctions are still imposed on that individual or entity. Also, it doesn't have to be a person. It could be like a boat that's their sanctions imposed upon. So it could be a person, a bank, a thing. Sanctions are sort of this wide-ranging thing that just means, in many ways, the U.S., individuals in the U.S. can't do business with or interact with this particular person on the list. I hope I'm helpful. Is this helpful so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is very helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, start with the CRS, if there's anything I can say from that, because I wouldn't have known about the list if I didn't go to the CRS. So let's go back to the document, if I can find it. So, all right. Now, we've gone through the CRS, we found out about the list, we found out about a lot of these things, and maybe a lot of it doesn't make sense to you, and that's okay. Like, a lot of this is extremely confusing, so I use Google. I Google everything. I also Google the person who wrote the CRS report. They're like really highly intelligent individuals. They all went to really fancy schools, and they're the best people to explain U.S. strategy and policy. In my experience, and maybe you all have had different experiences, the people who author the CRS reports don't really want to talk to reporters, or at least they can't be quoted, maybe not even on background, so it's not very helpful. So what I do is I go to LinkedIn, and I find that person on LinkedIn, and then I find people they went to school with, and then I find people who kind of do the same thing they do, and that's sort of the first venture into finding out. And this is, again, just thrown into this beat. So trying to do a lot of shoe leather reporting, finding out who is an expert on this topic, and they can explain more to me about what is the sanctions, like this registry of individuals. Why is it that the U.S. policy is not to impose an embargo the same way they would on Iran or North Korea? Why does our economic relationship look this way? Like, there are no stupid questions, and the stupider your question, the better answers you're going to get, I've found from asking questions. Okay, so, can you see that? Okay, so, also important is the understanding of federal agencies. I don't know if you've had a presentation on like OMB or the Federal Register, or just how agencies exist and how the president sort of, have we had that presentation? Mm-mm. Okay, so I'll say it very simply. There's the three branches of government, and then the reporters who watch them, mm-hmm. And then there's the president's ability to, with every federal agency, like the USDA, Treasury, Education Department, Labor Department, to, and forgive me if I'm like over-explaining, but it just helps to kind of, for me to go there, to appoint this individual who runs the agency. Every agency is going to have the same sort of methodology of having, like, every rulemaking goes on the Federal Register, and everything goes through the OMB, and that's how rulemaking goes, and that's how changes through the federal government work. So you can always check OMB, which is not as useful to me as the Federal Register, And that will not only include the postings of who's going on the sanctions list, but it'll also have updates on story ideas. I find it to be a very good story idea, like repository. So that, let's say, for instance, I'm having to cover this thing. Everybody else in the world is covering it. I just started, so I have 0 sources. Nobody trusts me because I'm brand new. So what can I do that other people can't? I can find documents before other people can. That's the very least I could do, because nobody at the White House trusts me to talk to them. So that's fair. So if you go to the Federal Register, you can get subscribed to updates for, let's say, OFAC with Treasury. You can go to the Treasury Department Federal Register entry and just subscribe to every single thing, which I did. And if you cover an agency, I would very highly suggest going to the Federal Register and subscribing to every single sub-agency and getting every single update you possibly can. And for me now, every day I get an update on who might be on the sanctions list. Sometimes I have no idea. A lot of times I have no idea who that individual is, so I forward it on to the Homeland Security person, and I make very good relationships with my coworkers, and I hope you do too. It's like, you will not be very good if you're not friendly and nice to your coworkers. So get on the Federal Register, you get those updates, and you can at least get the latest documents for what the government is mandating or is proposing to mandate. And it's really helpful for story ideas because, for instance, also in my advice that is kind of all over the place, if you listen to every interview that a very important person in this agency that's doing all these sanctions-related things is talking about. So, for instance, the other day I listened to Wally Adeyemo, who's the Deputy Treasury head, talk to the Post about just sort of sanctions and sanctions-related issues. And I try never to discount an interview done anywhere for any reason, because you never know what you're going to hear. And even when you think that it's like a nothing burger interview, he mentioned something that was to the extent of like, oh, we did some a law was passed last year that made it easier for us to, cover sanctions. And it was a 15-minute interview. Nobody really wrote about it. But what struck my kind of brain was, okay, there was a law that was passed last year, so these sanctions were anticipated in one way or another. So how can I go to this law and the Federal Register and sort of the rulemaking, and kind of, it's a very overwhelming experience, but just to see what kind of rulemaking and what kind of laws are being contemplated. And so after that interview, I went to the Federal Register, I looked up what this law was. I had no idea. It was the anti-money laundering law of 2020. And I was like, oh, okay, what's that? I don't know what this is. And I see that there's rulemaking related to this law. And the rulemaking has to do with the beneficial ownership of property. And it, in so many words, means that just because I owned this thing doesn't mean that if I give it to another person to use, that can't be in one way or another from the government seized or freezed or whatever, what have you. And so we know that the government is in one way or another looking at this process of sanctions and that kind of thing. So, yeah. So we've got going to the OMB, the Federal Register, looking at the sanctions list, and that's that. Am I going too fast or am I? Okay. So, one thing that my editor, Mike Tackett, he's my new editor, has asked me to do, every single interview, ask, what am I missing? And I would say maybe 50% of the time, no matter who I'm talking to, they always give me something I hadn't really thought of. So it's not a stupid question. I think everybody should ask that question. Normally I would ask something similar, but for whatever reason, that's a good one. Okay, so we've gotten the explainer on what sanctions are. We know where to find some of the rulemakings and at least some of the definitions of words. The next thing is to think of different story ideas, because everybody's going to have the same story idea, and you don't want to pursue the same story idea. Sometimes you have to write that story because everybody else is writing the story, but it's good to think of the story in different buckets. Like there's the economics bucket. How is Russia going to fare in this situation? How are we going to fare in this situation? We're talking a lot about oil. Like, what is it going to be like when gas is $6 a gallon, or it's already $1.25 today per barrel. So that's, the economics angle. So I always go to, when I want to talk to a economist, I go to NBER, which is a really fantastic repository of research where you can look up, again, I like very simplistic research terms. I used to do legal research, and we'd have to do this like N into something, and like it was almost mathematical. I think that's stupid. I'd rather just do a very simple search. If we look up Russia sanctions, and then you'll notice, okay, there's some papers from 1990, 1926. It's not really organized very well, but you can see certain names. And when you see the same names corresponding to the topic you're writing about being brought up, you know that that person is likely going to be a very good expert to talk to. Economists, my partner's an economist, they're very, I think they use like spaghetti math when they talk, and it's sometimes hard to condense what an economist is saying, and a lot of times their research is very, very, very difficult. So I found that in doing this kind of research, in this kind of interview, it can be difficult to talk to economists, but they will bring in certain perspectives that you never thought would be viable for a story idea. So, and they also know history really well. So do not discount NBER. And as a person in the media, you can get a media access. So you can access all these documents, which the average person could not. So take advantage of the rights that you have as a journalist. So there's the economics angle. Also, there was somebody who wrote a book recently about sanctions, so I bought the book, I read the first chapter and the last chapter, and then I called him. And he was a really great interview, and now he's a source who just like constantly gives me story ideas. So you should flatter people and buy their book and expense it with your employer. And then there's also the legal angle, because I didn't realize, when I started this beat, I didn't realize that there was so much law that was related to Treasury. I thought it was all economists and it was all data. There's a lot of data and a lot of economists, but so much of this is rulemaking. So think of the lawyers, and then the political angles of this situation is playing out also in Congress. Who are the lawmakers who are on committees that can effectuate some sort of change? Talk to them and talk to their press people. I always talk to their press people first. You seem to be Hill reporters, so you know way more about politics than I do. But the press people seem to be really nice and busy people. Yeah, and then my how to find sources, I'm sure you're all just very intuitively know how to do this. Cold calling people. There are a lot of times where I sit by my phone and I'm like, I don't want to call anybody today. Why am I a journalist? and it's just, if you call somebody randomly, they don't have to be the expert, or they don't have to, like, it could just literally be the lady next door, and you're just like, what do you think about this issue? As long as you're talking during work hours to somebody about your issue, that's better than being afraid of the phone. I think it's like okay to say sometimes journalists are afraid of the phone, but if you just randomly call someone, and that's another thing, don't underestimate your sources. So sometimes I get, especially since I started this job, I get these random people on LinkedIn or Facebook, and I use those things for professional use. I don't use them for personal use anymore. Just because they seem like they're not really high up there in the agency, or don't have a lot of connections, or just like, for me, it's crypto traders. I'm trying desperately to learn more about crypto trading, and the best sources have not been agency people. They've been like a random person on the internet who sees that I'm trolling these, or not trolling, but sitting in these Twitter forums about crypto, and I just like sit and listen, and people will reach out, and I get really good story ideas from talking to those people. So I wouldn't necessarily be afraid of, or like dismiss somebody just because they're not really high up somewhere or have a degree that specifically speaks to that issue. LinkedIn is amazing. That's where I go to find people who are formally in the agency, formally at OFAC. They're always going to be way more willing to go on the record than people who work at the agency. That's just a fact. Read your competitors' work and then call their sources. They will talk to you. And I don't know if that's a terrible thing to do, but those sources wanted, hey, Mark, how you doing? Yeah, and call your competitor sources. That's pretty simple.
Standard practice.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think it's a horrible thing to do. Also, these things are very, like, kind of standard. Embrace social media, read your competitors' tweets, and see who they're tweeting at, see who's tweeting at them, and then reach out to those people too. And then, yeah, the last thing is rely on your coworkers in other departments. I could not do this without the individuals that cover Homeland Security, national security, the crypto reporter, banking, business. If you're not really well connected with your coworkers, you should probably do that just because they want to help, and I imagine just because there's a topic you've been assigned doesn't necessarily mean that your coworkers have amazing expertise they can offer and tend to be really helpful. So if you notice, a lot of my stories, some of them are written with like 5 other people, and sometimes it's the White House reporter and I'm helping them. So it's, yeah, I hope that was helpful.
Fatima, thank you so much. This was so practical and useful, and I forgot to mention, like, one of the most important things about her bio, which is that she used to be sitting where you guys are.
Yeah.
So let's open it up for questions. Does anyone have any questions for Fatima?
Can you just talk a bit about, in terms of coming onto a beat in a subject, you know, where you already have colleagues who are established or who already are working in that area? I mean, what tips or, you know, things that have worked best for you in terms of situating yourself and finding a way to develop your own sources and your own, you know, profile without, I guess, while still also being collegial and everybody going the same direction, because, you know, people can be territorial sometimes in our business.
Definitely.
Thanks.
I think you are on the right track in terms of knowing that you want to show utmost respect to your colleagues who have the expertise, and then crafting out or carving out an area that you know you can offer that only bolsters the reporting, as opposed to, like, I'm going to make a name for myself and you guys are going to know me. So the way that I did it was I went to law school and I covered administrative law. So I very much, and also at Bloomberg Law, I covered federal agencies very closely. So the way that I approached it was, I'm good at agency reporting and I'm good at going through documents and Federal Register documents. So when there are times where it's breaking news, sometimes I'm not as good at jumping on the story and then having the story up first. That's not my best skill. My best skill is finding things other people can't find. So I would work with the reporters who are really good at what they're good at, and I would send them information in a couple of condensed sentences from this document that I found, and then I send them the link to the document. I think it's a lot of like sharing your work and sharing your skills, and not necessarily feeling like you have to be the best at everything all the time, because you're never going to be the best, and there's always going to be somebody better than you at something. So if you could just focus on that one thing you're really good at. For me, it was reading the law and knowing the law, but other aspects of it I may never be good at, but I'm trying to be better at it.
And are there specific stories that we should look, I mean, based on some of the advice you've given, like specific stories that you've written that we could like follow up and look at just to get a sense of like, oh, this is what she meant, or like this was an example of how, you know, listening to that thing led to this story?
Yeah, so on Friday, there was another batch of sanctions that were issued. I think that was the batch that was imposed on Putin's press secretary and a few other individuals. And what was notable about it was, in this batch of sanctions, there had been names of not just the father and son relationship, which we saw a lot of sanctions issued on, but also like wives and daughters. So that stuck out to me, and maybe that stuck out to a lot of people, but at the same time, as those sanctions were being issued, Wally Adeyemo had been interviewed saying there's this new law that just passed that helps us do this. And it was like a couple of words, but then I followed up with looking up the law and then seeing like corresponding the law to what was in the Federal Register to see like, okay, under the AML, there's this beneficial reporting requirement coming out. So as my coworker was writing up the story from the White House about the sanctions, I was pulling up the very boring stuff in the Federal Register that explains the extent to which the government has the ability to go after not just the oligarchs themselves, but also their family members, and under what kind of law. And the fact that it's changing, that's something that I added into that story.
Hi, I'm Suzanne with Roll Call. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Federal Register search capabilities, because it seems like they're maybe more than I am doing. I definitely subscribe to the immigration related departments, because that's what I cover, and just check it every morning at 8:45 or whatever, or maybe at 4:15. But it sounds like you were able to search a law and see all the rulemaking associated with that law since it passed. Is there an advanced search place in the Federal Register? What are some, I think, your best tips to navigate that website?
So that's a great question. The way, and I wish I had a better way of doing things, because you're right, it's very rudimentary, and I kind of like the rudimentary kind of search guidelines, because I don't know how to do advanced searches of things. I just know how to sort of go into this hole and then scan and scan and scan and scan. In terms of getting information first, subscribing to every single document. I know that with the Federal Register, for instance, if there's a specific, I don't know, the Financial Research Office, you can subscribe, but then it has when information's published, when it's on public inspection, and you have to do it separately for each subscription. I think that might be one of the things that could help a little bit. The way that I've sort of managed this, and this is just 2 months into the job, is, and maybe I can also help just talk about starting a new job in general during the pandemic, but if you subscribe very separately to every single thing, that might help. I just get every document sent to me, and I just read every single document, and it's very probably time consuming, but it also helps to learn so that I understand oh, this is what the Mint does. I had no idea, and I had no idea that this rulemaking was going through the Mint right now. I think as you master a topic, you can start to unsubscribe to things, but my approach has been subscribe to literally every single thing, and then I'd rather know it and it not be useful than to not know it and be asked, why didn't you cover this?
So I'm wondering, what's your method in terms of cold calling? For example, say you find somebody on LinkedIn from the ex-employee at the Office of Foreign Assets Control. You're making clear that you're very new to this field, you don't know much about it. How do you convince this person that you're the best person to talk to for these stories and for future stories?
Okay, so I'll come from the perspective of having come from Bloomberg Law. Most of my career has been at smaller outlets where I have to try to convince somebody to talk to me because they could easily talk to somebody from the New York Times, no offense, Mark, and it's just, they'll just talk to you. I think if you're at an outlet where you're not one of the big ones, you do have to try harder, and it's just, oftentimes people won't talk to you just because you don't work at that outlet. But what does help is if you can sort of have mastered the material before you talk to the person, so that they know that if you're coming from a smaller outlet, you at least have the capacity and understanding of the subject matter, so that people will talk. I generally, and maybe this doesn't work for everyone, but I just try to be super friendly and say, I'm trying to learn more about this. If you prefer to talk on background, we can talk on background, and then we can get quotes later. That usually helps a lot when I cold call people, because if a reporter called me to talk about something, I don't know if I would want to talk to them, but if they said we can just talk off the record or on background first, I think that helps a lot.
You mentioned the Congressional Research Services and the MBER. What are some other tools that you use when you're just starting off that have proven useful for you?
Google, definitely.
Yeah.
And so I started looking at Pacer. I used to work, so again, Bloomberg Law was amazing because I could find every single lawsuit regarding the thing that I was writing about, whereas Pacer, you have to pay for it, and I don't really like Pacer's search mechanism, but I think what's helpful is when you start off, if you're thinking, what are the universe of stories that are out there currently, and I just sort of read everybody else's work, and that's where I say call your competitors' sources, in the sense that if there's a story you really like and you feel like or you see a source that gives really good quotes to that person, you should reach out to them as well, and they might give you a different perspective. I think the reporter from the Insider's question is very good, because sometimes I'll read somebody's story and I won't have a question. I'm just sort of like, that was a great story, I have no questions. I think that's a very normal thing, to not necessarily have a question lined up, but just to say, I want to talk to you about this beat, I'm just learning, and people are very willing to chat. That's like the worst thing, when you don't have a question and you you need to know more, but you don't know what you don't know, so what am I going to ask? That's really helpful. Going on LinkedIn, I think, is one of the things I've learned now, and just finding like anybody who formerly worked at OFAC, and then like look up OFAC, and then it'll have on LinkedIn, and then it'll have everybody who put that on their resume who worked there. That's a way of doing a search. I think it's just like, don't think that there's any stupid way of doing things, and don't underestimate anybody that could potentially be a good source for a story. But yeah, NBER is good, LinkedIn is amazing, Pacer's good if you know what you're looking for, and yeah, the Federal Register is amazing as well, just because it can teach you things about your beat you had no idea.
When you're going through the process of learning a very technical new topic and you're reaching out to these sources to learn more, how do you walk that line of wanting to ask all the stupid questions, but also not wanting to be taken advantage of in terms of like folks maybe telling you things that aren't fully accurate because they know that you might not know exactly what's wrong?
That's a good question, because as a lady, sometimes people will underestimate you, but I think it is that fine line of trying to learn more about the beat, but also coming in with enough knowledge that if somebody says like the sky is green, you're like, the sky is green, okay. So it's like, I think that's where the CRS is helpful. Like, before you call someone, you shouldn't have zero basis of knowledge of what you're talking about. But if you can, for instance, I read the CRS and learned, okay, here's what the American strategy is regarding Russia. This is why Russia doesn't do certain things. This is why we're very concerned about oil. We have economic interests. And just having that basis, like doing a little bit of homework, is helpful, so that when you do call someone, you do have good questions. But I have found, when I ask stupid questions, and I do have the knowledge of what I'm talking about, I always get really, really, really good quotes from someone, because they're always really frustrated. They're like, I told you, I killed that lady. And you're like, oh, okay. And you get that good quote. So I think that's helpful. Like, stupid questions are very, very helpful. But yeah, you're right. Like, there was somebody who told me something about, and I think they were well-meaning. Like, I don't think people are, maybe I'm sure there are people who want to mislead you, but sometimes in doing research, you're just going to come across ideas that are wrong, and then going through that process of verifying it. When somebody told me Treasury employees are not allowed to trade cryptocurrency, I was like, that's a good story, because these are the people who are making the rules on cryptocurrency. And then I found out that that's not really the case. Actually, there are these ethical rules that apply to any kind of currency. So there was no story, but had I not followed that false kind of, or misleading claim, I wouldn't have found that out. And the people at Treasury were very helpful, because they didn't know the answer either, and we all learned something in sort of pursuing that question. So I don't think pursuing things just because they're wrong is really a fool's errand, because it could help you learn something about your beat.
Do you have any tips on how you stay organized if you're subscribing, to all of these feeds?
Mm-hmm.
Just, anything that you could offer.
Yeah. So yes, I started a new job 2 months ago, and I wanted to break a lot of the bad habits that I had in my previous job, where I was for 3.9 years. And I found that one of the best things I could do was create a sort of, and I did this, like, I went to a coffee shop and I sat for several hours enjoying myself while doing it. I made an Excel spreadsheet of literally from the very first email that was sent to me. And you're 4 months in, so it's possible to do this, but it'll take you a long time. But I just made a super spreadsheet of every person I had talked to and kind of broke it down by, like, okay, Congress people, economics people, Treasury sources, and then I have like 5 different pages, maybe 6, it'll grow, and it just has every single person. And whether or not that's actually useful is yet to be seen, but it does help to kind of create this placebo effect of, like, at least I have organization with my sources. So when when these sanctions came out on Friday, I could at least just go straight to my Excel spreadsheet and make a call and still have the like at least the access of that number on hand pretty quickly. You could just as easily go in your email and find it, but it is a thing where you have to be organized. Another thing I've been doing, and I imagine this will change because, again, 2 months in, I sort of, my notes for conversations or interviews, I right now have them spread out on the basis of topic in different Word docs. So, like, whenever it's about Russia sanctions, I have this massive spreadsheet now, and I just write down who I talked to and the time and day. And then if it's a very important interview, I use my tape-a-call or Otter, which, does everybody use Otter? It's amazing. It's like, wow. It's like, yeah, so, Otter's incredible. But, I think you're going to have to find your own method of organization, and a lot of it really is, like, impossible to organize because it's just such an incredibly daunting job. I think the best advice I would give to my old self and now to you is, like, at least answer every email of the day, and then you can figure out how to organize everything later, because that does help. And then having a paper planner, that helps too. I love my paper planner. Hey, Mark.
How do you keep an organization, like all the stuff you read? How do you organize, like, oh, I read you this thing, this is a good line, or this is a good graph, or this is a good section, and this kind of make notes so you can have it? How do you keep that stuff organized? Right now, for me, it's just in a pile on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to fix that. So
yeah.
Advice, that would be great.
How I organize things. Okay, this isn't a method, because we've talked about this. This is not fair. But one thing I've been doing is, because I am that reporter whose program crashes in the middle of the story, and I'm like, oh, I forgot to save my story. Like, I'm that person. I do now. I have lots and lots and lots of tabs open, and I will always have lots of tabs open. So if I know I'm about to leave the house, I, like, copy paste the links to every tab that I have open in a document, and I don't necessarily have to save it, because I could lose that document too. But it's just like a method of always having something. And then also something I do with my paper planner, because I have so many stories in the works, I sort of, like, for the next week, at the very top of my paper planner, I write out, like, okay, I'm working on this story, this story, this story, this story, this story. And then it's like a tiny to-do list. I think a paper planner works, because then you can list out all the things that are happening in the day. And, like, I don't really use the Outlook calendar. I should. Do you use the Outlook calendar? Everybody does? I just use it if somebody in my workplace or somebody wants to invite me to something, I put that, but I always write it in my paper planner, because that's my master planner. I like the paper planner. Who here has a paper planner? Okay, see? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate
Yeah,
you
thank
coming.
you. Thank you for having me.